Camille Watson wasn't meant to be seen. At least, not by the people who paid for 7-bedroom estates and drank wine older than most of the staff. She was there to serve, to move quietly between rooms, and disappear before the laughter started. A 52-year-old black woman from Memphis, Camille had worked in private homes for most of her life. No resume, no LinkedIn profile, just a reputation for being reliable, discreet, and efficient. That weekend, she'd been called in last minute to staff a corporate retreat in Flagstaff, Arizona, hosted by one of the most powerful men in tech. The job was simple: keep the glasses full and the linens crisp. But when billionaire CEO Richard Langford, slick-haired, scotch-sipping, and arrogant to the bone, called her over to a marble chessboard like a game show contestant, something changed. He thought it would be funny. He thought it would be quick. He thought he was in control. He was wrong. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The estate sat on 4 acres of pine-draped land just outside Flagstaff, like something out of a luxury catalog. Heated floors, vaulted ceilings, a wine cellar with a biometric lock. Every inch of the place was designed to impress and remind you of what you didn't have. The guests had flown in from all over: New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, executives with 7-figure bonuses, spouses with designer shoes that never touched dirt. Camille arrived in a shuttle van at sunrise, apron folded, lunch packed in a Tupperware container she'd had for years. She signed in at the back entrance and was told, like always, to stay out of sight unless needed. Richard Langford made his entrance later that evening like a man arriving at his own coronation. He greeted his guests with practiced charm, shook hands without looking at people, and gave toasts that sounded like TED Talks. In the center of the main hall, beneath a chandelier the size of a Buick, sat a custom chessboard carved from Italian marble and American oak. It was purely decorative, a symbol of intellect, strategy, and wealth. Richard didn't play for love of the game. He played to win, or more accurately, to be seen winning. By Saturday night, the retreat had shifted into its usual rhythm: bourbon-fueled banter, off-the-record deals, and stories of who beat who at what school or in what merger. Richard stood near the fireplace with a tumbler of aged Glenlivet, recounting a tale of how he once checkmated a hedge fund manager in 6 moves. The crowd chuckled. That was when he spotted Camille. She was walking through the hall with a tray of stemware, her movements steady and unhurried. Richard's voice cut through the room like a blade. "Hey, you, ever play chess?" The music dipped. The laughter stalled. Camille paused, glancing from Richard to the board and back again. "A little," she said quietly. "A little." Richard grinned, theatrically pulling out the chair opposite his. "Let's see what the help can do." It was supposed to be a joke, a flex, a way to show that brilliance wore suits and success came in the form of cufflinks and stock options. The room laughed, some awkwardly, some cruelly. Camille didn't laugh. She placed the tray gently on a side table, wiped her hands on her apron, and walked to the board. She didn't hesitate. She didn't look around for permission. She sat down. That's when the air changed. Not all at once. Not loud, but something in the way she carried herself. Shoulders relaxed, gaze focused, shifted the mood. People leaned in, phones were raised, some to record, some to distract from the tension building like a thunderhead above the polished wood floor. She wasn't bluffing. And Richard, for all his wealth and charm, hadn't realized what he'd just invited to the table. He thought this was checkers. Camille came to play chess. The clinking of crystal and soft jazz faded as Richard Langford's voice rang out like a shot across the polished floor of the estate's main hall. "You," he said, pointing with the same finger he used to close billion-dollar deals. "You ever play chess?" Camille Watson had been halfway across the room, balancing a silver tray lined with clean wine glasses. She stopped mid-step. Her eyes met his for a moment, and the room seemed to lean in, curious, amused, and vaguely uncomfortable. There was something about the way he said it, sharp around the edges, like a joke waiting to land. The tone wasn't friendly. It was performative, the kind of public call-out that turns a private moment into a spectacle. To most in the room, it was harmless, just a bit of rich man mischief, a quirky display of leadership from a man who fancied himself both philosopher and showman. But to Camille, it was clear as day. This wasn't an invitation. It was a test disguised as a game. She paused, looked at the board, then back at Richard. "A little," she replied, her voice steady but soft. Richard laughed, and the room followed, like a well-rehearsed cue. "Don't be shy," he said, loud enough for the walls to hear. "Let's see what the help can do." A ripple of laughter passed through the crowd again, some hesitant, some braver now that Richard had set the tone. Camille's lips pressed into a thin line. Her shoulders squared. She walked over, slow and deliberate, and placed the tray onto a nearby table with the kind of care that comes from years of not being allowed to drop a single thing. She wiped her palms on the sides of her apron. "If you want to play, I'll play," she said calmly. Richard's grin widened. He pulled out the chair opposite his with a flourish, like a magician revealing the final trick in a tired act. "That's the spirit," he said, performing now, not just for Camille, but for the executives gathered around with glasses in hand and half-laughs on their lips. The crowd shifted. Some stepped forward for a better view. One young executive in a navy blazer took out his phone, already recording. "You ever played at a board like this before?" Richard asked as Camille sat down. She looked at the table. The chessboard was gleaming white marble, with thick oak framing and heavy polished pieces that clacked like bones when set down. It looked more like a corporate trophy than a game. "No," she replied, "not quite like this." Richard cracked his knuckles and leaned in across the table. "Don't worry," he said with a smirk. "I'll go easy on you." Camille gave the faintest of smiles. "Please don't." That earned a few laughs, real ones this time. Janice Harper, the VP of Marketing, tilted her head. Something in Camille's tone didn't match the room's assumptions. She wasn't flustered. She wasn't playing along. She wasn't embarrassed. Richard made the first move. Classic King's Pawn E4. Predictable, flashy. The chess equivalent of a man revving a sports car at a red light. Camille responded with a bishop's pawn. Slower, quieter, a move built on long strategy, not short attention. By the third turn, Richard was narrating his moves for the audience. "Ah, the Italian game," he said smugly. "They teach this one in beginner books. It's all about control, positioning." Camille didn't respond. She slid her knight into place and rested her hands in her lap. From the side of the room, Janice leaned closer to her husband and whispered, "She's not just playing. She's studying him." Across the board, Richard cleared his throat. He was starting to feel something unfamiliar. Not fear, not yet, but uncertainty. It settled in the space between Camille's calm movements and his own performative ones, like a cold draft through a closed room. He tried to shake it off. "You sure you haven't played before?" he asked, narrowing his eyes. "A little," Camille said. "Oh yeah? Where?" "Fisk." A few heads turned. Fisk University, a historically black college, renowned for its academics, especially in science and engineering. "You studied there?" Richard asked, now feigning casual interest. "Computer science. Full ride." Silence settled in. No one said it, but you could feel it. The narrative was shifting. Richard blinked. He glanced back at the board, then back at her. "And now you clean houses?" Camille didn't flinch. "My mother got sick. I left before graduation to take care of her. Never went back." She moved her knight again, quiet and smooth. The piece landed with a faint click. The move wasn't flashy, but it cut off the entire left side of Richard's formation. For the first time, Richard hesitated. "You don't have to do something forever for it to matter," Camille said softly. The room stilled. No one had seen her coming. Not just because of who she was or what she wore, but because nobody had bothered to look. Richard's next move was sloppy, overconfident and reactive. Camille answered it with a bishop slide that blocked his queen. "You trap yourself when you don't respect the board," she said. That hit him harder than he expected. He leaned back in his chair and laughed, but it came out hollow. "You quoting Sun Tzu now?" Camille looked up. "Number?" "My uncle taught me that. He worked at a tire shop in Memphis, played chess on milk crates during lunch breaks." Richard shifted in his seat. This wasn't the game he'd planned to play. He had expected to win in 5 moves. He had expected applause, not reflection. He had expected to put Camille in her place. Instead, she was dismantling his ego, one quiet move at a time. His rook was pinned, his knight trapped, his queen cornered, and Camille? She just sat there, still, unmoved, unshaken. He leaned forward, desperate to regain control. "Let's reset, start over. This was just for fun, right?" Camille tilted her head slightly. Only people losing say that. You could hear the air leave the room. Someone near the back muttered, "She's not playing with him. She's playing through him." Richard's cheeks flushed. He looked up at the faces around him. His executives, his allies, his friends, people he paid, people who used to laugh at his jokes. But now? Now they were watching something else entirely, something real. He gritted his teeth. "You trying to prove something?" Camille folded her hands. "Number, just tired of pretending I don't know how to win." That line dropped like thunder. Janice whispered she wasn't just watching him. She was studying him. Richard scrambled, trying to recover with sarcasm. "What, you grew up playing this on some porch somewhere?" Camille's jaw stiffened. Number E grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment over a barber shop in Little Rock. We didn't have a porch. We had a coffee table with a broken leg and a hand-me-down board missing 2 pawns. She looked him dead in the eyes. I replaced them with bottle caps, still beat my brothers every week. It wasn't a boast, it wasn't loud, but it silenced the room like a closing door. From there, the game moved fast. Richard, rattled and off balance, reached for his queen, too late. His defense collapsed like bad scaffolding. "Check," Camille said. A pause, then a murmur, then silence. Richard stared at the board, at the broken lines of his attack, the isolated king at its center. He'd thought this was his moment to shine, but Camille had turned it into a mirror, and he hated what he saw. By the time she moved her rook and whispered, "Check in 2," the weight of the moment had fully landed, and all Richard Langford could do was sit there, still smiling on the outside, but losing everything he thought made him powerful, one piece at a time. For a moment, time seemed to still. The ice in bourbon glasses stopped clinking. Conversations faded into silence. All eyes were on the chessboard, and on the 2 people sitting across from it. Richard Langford, billionaire CEO, leaned forward like a man holding court. He had the bearing of someone who always assumed he was the smartest person in the room. His fingers hovered over the board with performative flair, moving with the same confidence that had carried him through years of boardrooms and power plays. The guests, his hand-picked circle of elite executives and partners, stood in a loose semicircle, watching, sipping expensive whiskey, exchanging glances that danced between amusement and discomfort. Across from him sat Camille Watson. No longer moving between trays or linens, she now sat with both feet flat on the ground, posture composed, hands folded in her lap. She didn't fidget, she didn't smile. She just watched, her eyes sharp and steady. Her gray work polo and black slacks might have seemed out of place next to Richard's designer blazer and Italian loafers. But there was something about her presence now, quiet, measured, unbothered, that made her impossible to overlook. Richard opened with a flourish, placing his pawn confidently on e4. It was a textbook move, the kind they teach in high school clubs and corporate icebreakers. Predictable, assertive. The kind of move that screams, "I know what I'm doing," even if the player doesn't. Camille didn't react right away. She glanced at the board, then reached forward and placed her pawn on e5. Simple, clean, centered. The most classic of responses. Nothing flashy, but already a signal that she wasn't just pushing pieces. She understood what was happening. Richard smirked, leaning back. "Well, we're off to a strong start," he said, glancing around for approval. The crowd chuckled, some genuinely, most politely. Next came Richard's knight, out to f3. Fast and aggressive. He moved like a man trying to win in 5. Camille met the pace, but not the panic. She moved her own knight to c6, mirroring him with precision. Her face remained unreadable. She didn't need to impress anyone, that much was clear. Janice Harper, standing toward the front of the crowd, crossed her arms and tilted her head. She'd seen Richard play before, plenty of times at company retreats and holiday parties. He liked to narrate his moves, dominate the board, and end things quickly. But tonight was different. There was no nervous energy coming from Camille, just calm calculation. "Is she matching him?" Janice whispered to Alan Drake, the CFO, who stood beside her. Alan leaned in slightly. "She's doing more than that. Look at her lines. She's not just defending, she's setting traps." Richard's fingers danced across the top of a bishop. "This one's called the Italian game," he said to no one in particular. "Old school, elegant, very strategic." Camille didn't respond. She adjusted one piece, her bishop gliding quietly into position. Richard cleared his throat. "You sure you didn't play in college?" "I told you I did," she replied evenly. Right, Fisk, wasn't it?" he said with forced casualness, as if the name were just another detail, not something that had shifted the energy in the room earlier. "Yes," she said, "computer science." He chuckled. "So, you traded in algorithms for aprons?" She didn't blink. "I took care of my mother. That was the job that mattered." Her tone wasn't defensive. It wasn't bitter, it was just the truth. And in that moment it had the weight of a confession and the force of a slap. The guests shifted on their feet. Someone lowered their drink. Someone else put their phone away. On the board, Richard pushed forward, sending his pawn to d4, aiming to open the center quickly. He wanted control, he needed it. But Camille's response was surgical. Her knight swept to f6, covering the center, blocking his plans. "You don't seem nervous," he said after a long pause. "There's no reason to be," she said. A few guests exhaled through their noses. Not quite laughter, not quite disbelief. Richard narrowed his eyes, and suddenly the room wasn't quite so warm anymore. The fire crackled behind him, but he felt a cold edge pressing in, doubt. He leaned closer to the board. Camille moved another piece, her bishop sliding across a diagonal line like a shadow. Quiet, clean, unapologetic. "She's pushing him back," Alan muttered. "He doesn't see it yet." "Oh, he sees it," Janice replied. "He just doesn't know how to respond." Richard scratched his chin. He looked up. The crowd wasn't chuckling anymore. They were watching, really watching, like something important was unfolding. "You've got some moves," he said, trying to lighten the mood. "I've had to," Camille replied, locking eyes with him. The silence after that was heavy, thick with realization. Richard made another move, dropping his rook into play, trying to assert dominance. But it was too early, too aggressive. Camille didn't even flinch. She studied the board, moved a pawn with delicate precision, and waited. "You trap yourself when you don't respect the board," she said softly. And that's when the shift became impossible to ignore. The game wasn't about chess anymore. It was about power, about perception, about how easily a man like Richard could underestimate a woman like Camille because of the way she dressed, the job she held, the quiet way she moved through a room. But here, on the board, the rules were different. On the board, money didn't matter. Status didn't move the pieces. Ego didn't guarantee victory. Here, only skill did. And Camille had it. Richard's next few moves came faster, more reactive. He was playing to recover now, not to lead. He sacrificed a pawn without realizing he'd opened his flank. Camille took it calmly, like she'd known it was coming. The audience leaned in. Someone whispered, "Is he losing?" Janice nodded slowly. He's already lost. He just doesn't know it yet. Richard sat back in his chair. His drink sat untouched. His hand twitched near the board, unsure of what to move next. Camille waited. Silent. Still. Her next move came after a full 30 seconds of quiet. Queen to G5. A murmur rolled through the room. It was a bold move, but not reckless. It didn't scream for attention. It simply took control. Richard's remaining knight was blocked, his rook trapped. His king sat exposed like a man with too many enemies and not enough allies. "She's suffocating his defense," Alan muttered under his breath. Janice folded her arms tighter. "She's not rushing. That's what makes it worse. She's planned this." Across the table, Richard tried to laugh it off. "You all act like she's Magnus Carlsen or something. Let me breathe." Nobody laughed. Camille didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her hands were folded again. Her back was straight. She wasn't enjoying his discomfort, but she also wasn't softening to it. He gritted his teeth. "You trying to prove something?" She leaned back slightly, gaze calm. "No," she said. "Just tired of pretending I don't know how to win." And that was the moment, the one everyone would remember. Not because it was loud, not because it was dramatic, but because it cut through the room like a razor through silk. Richard Langford, a man who built an empire by never letting others see him sweat, was sweating now. Not from heat, not from nerves, but from the unfamiliar sensation of losing without excuse. And Camille Watson, the woman he thought was invisible, was about to show them all just how clearly she saw the board, and everyone sitting around it. The silence that settled over the Langford estate wasn't accidental. It was earned, piece by piece, breath by breath, through a game that had turned from entertainment to revelation. The board, once just an opulent centerpiece between brandy glasses and whispered stock tips, now demanded reverence. And at its center sat two players, one used to being seen as a king, the other long trained in how to move without being seen at all. Richard Langford leaned over the board, his smile brittle, fingers twitching near his knight. Across from him, Camille Watson sat still. completely still, as if she had all the time in the world. As if she'd done this before. Not just the chess part, but the part where someone underestimates her in front of an audience and expects her to fold quietly into the background. She'd lived this scenario more than once. Just never with a marble chessboard and a $2,000 bottle of scotch nearby. The guests, who had once circled the board out of curiosity, now stood in a tighter ring. The mood transformed. Nobody checked their phones. Nobody whispered jokes. Even the servers had slowed, pausing near doorways with trays still in hand. Everyone was watching, and not because of who Richard was, but because of who Camille had revealed herself to be. He moved his queen aggressively, trying to reclaim space. It was a bold move, but not smart. He was trying to recover by force, like someone yelling louder in a debate they were losing. Camille responded with elegance. She slid a pawn forward, deliberate and quiet. "You trap yourself when you don't respect the board," she said gently. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a clapback. It was a mirror held up in real time. And Richard, for all his money, power, and experience, didn't like what he saw in the reflection. He leaned back and laughed, nervously, this time. "You quoting Sun Tzu now?" Camille looked up, her face calm. "No," she said, "my uncle taught me that." There was a pause. He worked at a tire shop in Memphis, played chess on milk crates outside during his breaks. And with that, a crack formed in the narrative that had filled the room an hour earlier. This wasn't just a maid who could play. This was a woman shaped by real struggle, real sacrifice, and quiet brilliance cultivated far outside the corridors of privilege. Richard shifted uncomfortably. His rook was blocked. His queen was isolated. His pawns were scattered like bad ideas. For a man who'd spent decades believing he controlled every room he's entered, the helplessness crept in like cold air beneath a locked door. Across the board, Camille was unmoved. Her hands remained folded. She didn't lean forward. She didn't gloat. Janice Harper noticed it first. "She's not reacting to him," Janice whispered to Alan. "She's reading him." Camille reached for her rook and moved it quietly into the corner. It looked like a small move, just a piece shifting from one square to another. But then the room saw it. A double threat, both silent and devastating. "Check," she said. There was no drama in her voice, no flourish, just that single word, check, spoken like a fact too important to dress up. Richard blinked. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered. But he knew she wasn't. The pieces didn't lie. He hovered his hand over his bishop, then his knight, then back to his queen. Nothing worked. Every route was choked, every escape sealed. And Camille? She just waited. Not because she needed to prove anything, but because she already had. "You've got some moves," he said, trying to regain charm. "Maybe I underestimated you." Camille's reply was even, almost gentle. "Maybe." Some of the executives chuckled, not because it was funny, but because they didn't know what else to do. Richard looked around the room. These were his people, his lieutenants. He signed their bonuses, approved their vacations, rubber-stamped their projects, but tonight none of that mattered. Power didn't protect you on the board. He reached forward and moved a pawn, clumsy, desperate. "You should have castled," Camille said simply, moving another piece into place. Another trap, this time along the center line. "He's getting boxed in," Alan muttered. "He already is," Janice added. Camille's voice stayed quiet. "The board doesn't care who you are, Mr. Langford. It just reflects how you think." That line didn't echo. It landed. Richard opened his mouth, then closed it. There was no comeback. Not one that didn't feel like reaching. Because everyone in the room knew the truth, he hadn't invited Camille to play out of curiosity or respect. He'd done it to get a few laughs, to show how far above her he stood. It was never about chess. It was about status, about control. But now, control was slipping like water through his fingers. And the room had turned. What had begun as mockery had become revelation. Someone in the back whispered, "She's not just playing him. She's exposing him." And it was true. Every move Camille made wasn't just a strategy. It was a statement about who we value, who we ignore, and what happens when someone decides not to shrink. Richard's voice cracked. "Let's just call it even. No need to finish. We all know where this is going." Camille raised an eyebrow. "You want to quit?" I just mean, this was supposed to be light, right?" She nodded slightly. Only people losing say that. The line didn't sting. It didn't need to. The truth had its own sharpness. Someone behind Richard whispered, "Damn." He didn't turn around. He didn't want to see which of his inner circle had stopped rooting for him. He tried again, moving a bishop to block. Camille slid her knight forward, pinning his rook. Another gasp. She said nothing. She didn't need to. "Okay," he said, his voice thinner now. "Now you're just showing off." Camille didn't flinch. "You invited me to play. I'm playing." That was the moment he truly realized he had no power here, and that terrified him. "You trying to prove something?" he snapped, more defensive now. She leaned back, calm as ever. "Just tired of pretending I don't know how to win." A long silence followed. Janice stepped closer. She hadn't expected to see a woman like Camille in this space, let alone watch her dismantle a tech mogul's ego with nothing more than logic and poise. But here it was. Undeniable. She wasn't just playing the board, Janice whispered to Alan. She was studying him. Richard made one last move. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't enough. Camille slid her queen forward, smooth, certain. "Checkmate," she said. You could have heard a wine glass drop. No one spoke, not even Richard. His hand hovered, then dropped. He stared at the board like it had betrayed him, like he couldn't believe this was happening. But it was, and no amount of charm or authority could undo it. Camille stood, not quickly, but with dignity. She adjusted her apron. Then, silently, she began resetting the pieces on the board. One by one, no applause, no cheers, no theatrics, because Camille didn't need a victory lap. She'd already won. And as she walked away, back toward the kitchen, the same place she'd come from, she didn't look back. She didn't need to. Because what she left behind wasn't just a checkmate. It was the truth. And it was sitting on that board in plain sight, waiting for everyone else to finally see it. By now, the tension in the Langford estate was no longer a slow simmer. It had reached a quiet, merciless boil. The marble chessboard no longer sat like a trophy in the center of the room. It had become a battlefield. The hardwood floor beneath it might as well have been scorched earth. Every piece still standing told a story of mistakes made, positions lost, assumptions shattered. And at the center of it all sat two people, one unraveling, the other unshaken. Richard Langford stared at the board, but he wasn't really looking at it anymore. His eyes were glassy, unfocused, scanning the pieces as if they had betrayed him, as if they'd moved themselves into failure while he wasn't watching. His once confident hands now hovered indecisively, moving from rook to knight to bishop, then retreating each time. He was a man trying to will a future that no longer existed. Camille Watson, on the other hand, hadn't moved anything but her rook in the past 30 seconds. She didn't need to. The trap was already set. The net was drawn. The finish line was in sight. Not just for the game, but for the illusion of superiority Richard had clung to since the first pawn left its square. The guests stood still, not one of them checking their watch or glancing at their phone. You could have heard the wind brushing against the pine trees outside. A few of the servers paused mid-step, balancing trays of brandy and water, no longer invisible. No one was watching the CEO anymore. They were watching her, the maid who'd been brought into the room as a joke and was now writing the final chapter of a story no one had expected. "You act like she's Magnus Carlsen or something," Richard muttered, forcing a tight, joyless laugh. "Let me breathe, for God's sake." No one laughed with him. Camille remained still. She hadn't blinked in some time. There was no gloating on her face, no smirk, no sense of vengeance, just calm. The kind of calm that comes from knowing who you are, and knowing that you don't need anyone else to say it out loud. She moved her queen to G5. The soft click of the marble on marble made someone near the back gasp. Janice Harper's hand went to her mouth. Alan Drake, the CFO, took a step forward. Richard's knight was now blocked. His rook pinned. His king sat like a man without allies, naked at the center of a failing defense. "She's suffocating his board," Alan whispered. Janice nodded, and she's doing it slowly, gracefully. Richard leaned back, his lips twitching. All right, that's enough." Camille raised an eyebrow. "Enough? This isn't a tournament," he said, chuckling again, the sound thin as paper. It was supposed to be a fun moment, a little challenge, no one's keeping score. Camille's voice was soft. "Only people losing say that." Someone actually dropped a glass. It didn't shatter, but it might as well have. The sound punctuated the silence like an exclamation mark. The room winced. He rubbed his forehead, trying to gather himself. The crowd felt like a jury now, and for the first time in his life, Richard Langford wasn't the one holding court. He was on trial, and the only evidence needed was right in front of him. Black and white, carved from stone. "Let's be honest," he said, trying to steady his voice. "You probably grew up playing this on porches somewhere, right?" Camille's jaw stiffened. She looked up, not angry, but precise. "No," she said. "I grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment over a barber shop in Little Rock. We didn't have a porch. We had a coffee table with a broken leg and a hand-me-down board missing 2 pawns." She paused. "I replaced them with bottle caps. Still beat my brothers every week." The words landed with more weight than a shout ever could. It wasn't just a line, it was a life. A quiet declaration that brilliance doesn't need privilege to exist. It can grow in tight corners, between night shifts, in the places people like Richard never have to think about. He looked back down, mouth slightly open. The next move came fast, too fast. A pawn thrown forward like a flailing punch. Camille, unfazed, responded with a rook to the corner. 2 threats in one movement. Her voice didn't rise, but her words rang out clear. "Check in 2. There was no doubt now. She was no longer playing the game. She was finishing it. "Okay," Richard said, half laughing, half pleading. "Now you're just showing off." Camille looked at him, cool and composed. "You invited me to play. I'm playing." Every executive standing in that room understood the subtext. This wasn't about chess anymore. It hadn't been for several moves now. This was about something else. How you treat people when you think no one's watching. Richard had used his power to turn Camille into a prop, but she had turned the moment into a mirror. "You trying to prove something?" he snapped, his frustration finally cracking through the surface. Camille folded her hands again, her tone as even as ever. "Number just tired of pretending I don't know how to win." That broke something in the air. Not tension, truth. You could feel it move through the room like a wave. Janice whispered to Alan she wasn't just playing the board, she was reading him since the first move. Richard clenched his jaw and moved his bishop, trying to block the threat. Camille didn't flinch. She reached forward one final time, smooth and slow, and slid her queen into position. Checkmate. The word hung in the air like a bell toll, final, inevitable. Gasps. One assistant actually let out a quiet damn. Richard froze. His eyes scanned the board, hoping for a loophole, a mistake, anything to cling to. But there was nothing. His hand dropped from the table like someone letting go of an illusion. He'd lost. And there was no joke big enough to erase it. Camille stood, not fast, not triumphant, just deliberate. She adjusted her apron. The room stayed still, waiting for something. An exit line, a smirk, a glance over the shoulder. But she gave them none of that. Instead, she began putting the pieces back where they belonged. One by one. The way you would clean up after a party you weren't invited to. Richard sat motionless, his drink untouched. He watched her hands move, stunned into stillness. His cheeks were red. His chest rose and fell with slow, uncertain breaths. He finally spoke, barely above a whisper. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Camille looked at him. Really looked at him. I know, she said. That's the problem. No anger, no mockery, just honesty. Delivered with the kind of clarity that makes people change, or crumble. Then she turned and walked away, her shoes quiet on the hardwood, leaving behind a silence louder than anything she could have shouted. And that silence didn't belong to Richard. It belonged to everyone in the room who had once seen her as invisible. Now, they couldn't look away. The board remained. Pieces reset. But nothing would ever be the same again. Sunday morning at the Langford estate came with the smell of scrambled eggs, fresh biscuits, and coffee strong enough to wake the dead. The sunlight spilled across the long oak dining table in gold streaks, illuminating crystal glasses, polished silverware, and faces that no longer carried the same smug ease from the night before. The laughter that once echoed through the stone halls had been replaced by hushed conversations and thoughtful glances. Something had shifted. Something fundamental. Richard Langford sat at the head of the table, as always, but this morning he looked different. Not in the way he dressed, which was still impeccable, but in the way he carried his silence. His plate remained untouched. His tie was loose. His jaw clenched. The usual confidence, that casual arrogance he wore like cologne, had thinned into something quieter, unfamiliar to everyone who knew him. Across the room, Camille Watson moved between tables with a coffee pot in one hand, refilling cups without a sound. Same apron, same steady pace. But now people watched her. Not because she demanded attention, she never had, but because no one could ignore her anymore. She hadn't said much since the game. She hadn't needed to. Her presence, once overlooked, now carried the kind of weight that made people stand a little straighter when she walked by. She poured a refill for Janice Harper, who smiled and offered a gentle, "Thank you." Not out of habit, out of respect. At the end of the table, CFO Alan Drake cleared his throat. "Camille," he said, just loud enough to be heard. She turned slightly. "You ever think about coaching chess?" Camille raised an eyebrow, mid-pour. "Not really," she said with a faint smile. He chuckled. "You should. I'd sign up in a heartbeat." There were a few nods, a few soft chuckles. Even that small exchange felt monumental, like a ripple through a pond that had just been struck by lightning the night before. Richard watched it all, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup, his thoughts drifting not to business or strategy or profit margins, but to that board, to that moment, to every piece she had moved with surgical precision and every truth she had delivered without raising her voice. Finally, he spoke. "Camille," he said, not loud, but clear enough to freeze the room. She turned, quiet and calm, and waited. He stood slowly. His voice, usually bold and measured, came out low, uncertain. "I owe you an apology," he said. The room froze. He swallowed, and for a man used to having the last word, it took more effort than anyone could see. "What I did yesterday, it wasn't just a joke, it was disrespectful." Camille said nothing. She just listened. "I saw you working," he continued, "and I thought I was being clever. I thought it would be funny. I didn't expect you to, you know." He trailed off. Camille finished it for him. "Win?" He looked down. "Yeah, that." All eyes were on her. Some guests expected a speech. Others braced for a cold retort, but Camille wasn't performing for anyone. She never had. "You didn't respect the board," she said. "And you didn't respect me. That's what hurt, not the joke. Not even the assumptions. Just the fact that I was never meant to be taken seriously." The words sat heavy in the room like rain clouds refusing to move. Richard looked like a man seeing clearly for the first time in years. "You're right," he whispered. He stood still for a moment, then slowly sat down again. His gaze didn't leave the table. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. But something had broken, not in Camille, but in him. After brunch, the estate turned quiet again. Luggage rolled across the tile. SUVs lined the gravel driveway. The staff moved quickly to clear rooms and strip beds. The guests, now unusually polite, offered real thank yous. A few even paused to speak to Camille. One woman from San Francisco gave her a business card and whispered, "If you ever want something different, call me. I mean it." Camille accepted the card but said nothing. Her job wasn't done yet. Later, near the back hallway, Janice caught up with her. "I meant what I said yesterday," she told Camille. "You don't need to play for applause. You already earned something more valuable." Camille gave her a curious look. "What's that?" "Respect, and not the kind that disappears when the applause fades, the kind that makes people move differently." Camille smiled faintly. "Maybe, but respect only means something if it changes behavior." Janice nodded. "Then I hope yesterday sticks." So did Camille. She returned to folding towels and restocking linens. Quiet, methodical, the same way she approached everything. But behind her, something stirred. Richard Langford appeared, standing just outside the doorway. He held something in his hand, not a drink, not a gift, just a small, folded envelope. He didn't say anything, just extended it toward her, then turned and walked away. Camille waited until he was gone to open it. Inside was a handwritten note. "You taught me more in 15 minutes than most consultants have in 15 months. You reminded me that power isn't how loud you speak, it's how well you listen. Thank you for playing the game and for winning it with grace. R.L." Below the signature there was a check. Camille's breath caught in her chest, not because of the amount but because it was more than she had ever been paid for any job. Enough to pay off her debts, enough to breathe, enough to matter. She folded the note and the check back into the envelope and tucked it into her apron pocket. Then she returned to her cart. Because she hadn't played to be seen. She hadn't played to be rewarded. She'd played because someone had asked if she could, and she had answered in a language they finally understood. That evening, as the last SUV pulled out of the circular driveway and the estate echoed with emptiness, Camille cleaned the chessboard one final time. She didn't rush. She didn't linger. She wiped each square, reset each piece. She paused with the queen in her hand, just for a second. Then she placed it upright, perfectly centered, equal again, white and black, silent, balanced, until someone makes the first move. Then, without a word, she turned and walked away. Back to her cart, back to her work. But not back to invisibility, because now, whether they liked it or not, they had seen her, and some truths, once seen, can never be unseen. By Monday morning, the Langford estate had emptied. The laughter was gone, replaced by the quiet hum of final checklists and retreating footsteps. The luxury SUV that had carried Richard Langford back to his office in downtown Phoenix rolled to a stop outside a towering glass building. The man who stepped out looked the same, but something inside him had shifted. He didn't speak of the game. Not to his board, not to his executive team, not even to his assistant, who asked about the weekend with a cheerful, "How was the retreat?" He only nodded and walked into his office, shut the door, and stood for a long time in front of a photo on his wall, a group shot of the top executives from the night before. The same people who had watched him lose. But more than that, the same people who had watched him learn. He opened his laptop and stared at the screen. After a pause, he opened the company's HR portal and began typing. Create initiative. Professional development program for support staff. Include tuition assistance, mentoring opportunities, and executive shadowing tracks. Launch Q1. He paused, then added one more line. Title, The Camille Watson Initiative. He sat back in his chair, a long breath escaping his chest. For once, this wasn't about metrics or margins. It was about doing the right thing, because someone had shown him the difference between being powerful and being worthy of respect. Meanwhile, Camille returned to her life. She didn't brag. She didn't post. She didn't even tell the staffing agency what had happened. But something was different. Her regular clients seemed warmer, kinder. One of them even asked her hesitantly, "Would you ever teach chess?" She didn't answer right away. She just smiled. She didn't need a platform. Her power was never in being heard. It was in being understood. And slowly, that weekend began to ripple outward. A few of the retreat guests quietly updated their hiring practices. Janice Harper pushed for new DEI training and privately began sponsoring young black women in marketing programs. Alan Drake reached out to Camille through a private channel, offering to pay for her to return to college. No strings attached. She hadn't decided yet. But something bigger than a scholarship had already happened. People had seen her. Not just looked at her, but really seen her. And for someone who had worked decades in silence, that was the real checkmate. It wasn't just about who won or who lost. It was about the way Camille carried herself in a room designed to erase her. The way she held the truth without raising her voice. The way she changed hearts, not with fire, but with precision. In the end, chess was just the tool. The real lesson was about dignity, grace, and the courage it takes to stand in your full power, even when the room never planned to give you a seat. No headlines were written, no press releases followed, but something shifted. Because when someone like Camille walks through a room the way she did, no one forgets her. She didn't need applause. She didn't need validation. She just needed a moment. And when that moment came, she moved. Did this story move you like it moved us? What would you have done if you were in that room, silent like the crowd or bold like Camille? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear your voice. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a moment of truth, power, and real-life transformation. More stories are coming. Quiet revolutions, powerful lessons, and reminders that the most unexpected voices often teach the greatest truths.